We need to keep all options on the table, including the possibility of U.S. ground troops in Taiwan, if that's something the American people would support. No, we're not talking about ground troops or escalating militarily in response to some of the recent provocations of the Chinese communists, including doing military exercises where they encircle Taiwan. The idea that a blockade of Taiwan may be in the offing.
I feel like we're getting mixed messages from our government.
Slightly. Here's Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, on the decision has been made in Beijing.
In my analysis of China, is that at least their military and perhaps others have come to some sort of conclusion that war with the United States is inevitable. I don't believe war is inevitable. I don't think it's imminent. But I do think that we need to be very, very pragmatic and cautious going forward, and we will reduce the likelihood of war if we remain really, really strong relative to China, and China knows that we have the will to use it if necessary.
Okay, so Beijing's made the decision, but it doesn't mean that's the final. Doesn't mean that becomes the final result. There, we need to be strong. I mean, we need to provide some sort of deterrent. Well, retired Admiral William McRaven was on Brian Kilmeade's radio show. And he said, I guess, with the idea of a deterrent, he took a more conciliatory tone. A deterrent would be finding common ground with the Chi-Coms on climate or trade.
But I would offer that we still need to find some common ground, because here's why. If we continue to push China away, where will China go? They will build this alliance with Russia, and they will strengthen it.
They did it.
Right. So our goal should be to separate China from Russia. And the way you do that is, once again, you hold them accountable, but you also have to find some common ground. Find common ground in trade. Find common ground in climate. Find common ground somewhere where we can engage with them, so that if we do have a dust up in the South China Sea, all of a sudden it doesn't escalate into war. And then by building a little bit of this contentious relationship, we can start to separate them from, their buddies there in Russia.
Boy, I'm not sure I understand the prospect. I'm not sure I understand much of what Admiral McRaven said. I don't know what the common ground looks like, just general categories where we may achieve something. What's John Kerry and sitting over there talking about shutting down these coal-fired energy plants you're building? I don't know how that's going to achieve common ground. And then accountability. Accountability, what does that look like, and on what issue? Well, the politicians are being even more aggressive than that. Of course, Lindsey Graham, who wants to go to war with everybody all the time right now, had this to say about those military exercises the Chinese Communist military is engaged in, encircling Taiwan. Well, if China installs a blockade on Taiwan, then we should blockade mainland China and not allow oil shipments in. I don't think that's finding common ground. I think that would escalate things quickly, but this is what he said.
I think they're setting the stage possibly for a blockade of Taiwan, that the Communist Chinese Party is going to test us dramatically this year and next year before the election. So in 1961, the Russians tried to isolate West Berlin. So I'm fearful that the Chinese may be setting conditions to blockade Taiwan in the coming months or weeks, and we need to respond forcefully. If they do that, we need to blockade oil shipments coming from the Mideast to China, and let them know, if you blockade Taiwan, we're going to cut off your oil. We need to train more aggressively Taiwanese forces so they can fight like the Ukrainians. We need to put nuclear-tipped missiles back in our submarines. Biden won't do it. The military has asked for nuclear-tipped cruise missiles to be put back in submarines like the Russians did. And we need more forces in the region. I think if you do those things, you could deter a blockade.
Chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee, Mike McCall, House Foreign Affairs Committee, Republican from Texas, he had this to say about if the conflict escalates, what are we willing to do? What should we be thinking about? And, of course, these recommendations come with the caveat, if the American people support this. But it seems to me like they're trying to begin the building of support for the sorts of escalations they're discussing.
I think, then you're talking about an authorized use of military force that would come out of my committee, or a declaration of war, which we haven't utilized since World War II.
Would you support that?
I think if China, Communist China, invades Taiwan, I think that is certainly, if the American people support this, the Congress will follow.
You're saying that the option to authorize war powers is on the table.
If Communist China invaded Taiwan, it would certainly be on the table and something that would be discussed by Congress and with the American people. Are they prepared to do this? Is Taiwan worth it? I can argue for a lot of reasons why it is.
For more on this, a deeper understanding, pleased to be joined by Lieutenant Colonel Jim Carafano from the Heritage Foundation. Jim, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Where to begin? We ought to start with, why do we care about Taiwan? And that's not funny. It is a serious issue. Taiwan's, it's not about chips and it's not about democracy or anything. Taiwan is the crucial island in what's called the first island chain. And this is essentially, if China controlled everything from the South China Seas through Taiwan, essentially the United States would cease to become a nation power. I mean, they could lock us out of Asia. And I think that's intolerable to the United States. So the challenge has always been is both the United States and China have a vital interest in Taiwan. China's always wanted to reclaim Taiwan, and the United States has never wanted China to be able to reclaim Taiwan. And the way we've maintained the status quo over many decades is we've each kind of agreed in our own way not to challenge the other country's vital interests. And as long as that status quo remains, there won't be a conflict over Taiwan. But when that status quo is violated, there actually probably would be a conflict over Taiwan. And so the answer to the question is, how do we prevent China from taking Taiwan, and how do we not have a war, is we continue to deter China from thinking they have the military capacity and capability to take over the island.
Yeah, but
So-
what's America's response be? I mean, should we ever put troops on the ground?
Well, that's kind of a stupid thing, right? It's like, it's like there's a bridge, right? And you don't want the enemy to cross the bridge. Do you put troops in the middle of the bridge? And the answer is, well, usually no. That's probably the worst place for the troops to be. Troops should be on the hill that's overwatching the bridge and controlling access to the bridge. So what's really crucial about limiting the ability of the Chinese to take Taiwan is the Sea of Taiwan, right? So if they can't maintain crossing that sea and bringing over troops and ammunition and logistics and airplanes and everything else, then they can't control Taiwan. So America's critical contribution to the defense of Taiwan is not allowing China to control the sea lanes that link Taiwan and the mainland. And so that's our main contribution, not putting troops on the ground in Taiwan. That's just kind of stupid. As a matter of fact, that's actually a red line. I mean, the kind of unstated status quo is we would never put troops there to actually defend Taiwan. And if we actually did do that, that's actually something that I think there's two things that the Chinese would see as just an intolerable red line. One is if American troops were actually put in Taiwan for the defense of Taiwan. And the other one is if Taiwan declared independence. These are what the Chinese have stated both publicly and in private for many, many decades. And so I assume that those are still probably the two key red lines from their perspective.
Well, so that's not what Lindsey Graham or Mike McCall said. Lindsey Graham talking about more force in the region in addition to the threat of you blockade Taiwan, we blockade you. And I know he didn't say ground troops in Taiwan at this stage, but neither one of them have ruled anything out either. So is that smart? Does that have some sort of deterrent effect on Beijing, or is it laughed off by Beijing, knowing that neither Lindsey Graham or Mike McCall are the commander in chief?
Well, if I ever agreed with Lindsey Graham on foreign policy, it's usually by mistake or by coincidence or by accident. What the Chinese look at in looking at the correlation of forces is, can the United States prevent China from controlling the sea lanes and the air lanes between Taiwan and China? That's the key thing that they look at. And I think the answer today is that's a very risky proposition for them. I mean, people run these war games all the time. Matter of fact, we just ran a war. We run one every year on Taiwan, and invariably, can the Chinese cross the waters? Yes. Can they put troops actually physically in Taiwan? Yes. Can they actually take over the island and sustain those lanes if the United States and other countries try to prevent them? And the answer is no. Now, that may change 5-10 years from now as the United States, if we don't keep up with China, as China's military continues to grow, and they may gain the confidence to do that. But the Chinese just witnessed in Ukraine what happens when you think you're going to have a short, quick, decisive war, and it doesn't turn out that way. And the Chinese wouldn't want to risk that in Taiwan. They do have a doctrine, and their idea is called winning without fighting. I mean, it goes back to the days of Sun Tzu. They would prefer that things just go their way. And if you look, the Chinese have fought one big war with us, and that was the Korean War, and it didn't end well. They fought a war with the Vietnamese, and it didn't end well. They've had border skirmishes with the Indians, and it didn't end well. They've never actually achieved outside of China, significant military success, and they would prefer not to fight. They would prefer to have things just fall in their lap. So I do think that China still thinks that they can intimidate their way into Taiwan just falling in their lap, or the Chinese will elect a government which will just fall into their lap. And as long as those are very, very real possibilities, I don't think risking World War III is on the menu. Now, having said that, if they felt that red lines were crossed and they were really backed into a corner, which is Taiwan declaring independence, then they might go there. But I think the safest way to ensure there isn't a conflict and to protect American interests is if we continue to develop the military capacity to protect our own interests, which is, this is like, why are we even having this debate? It's like if you have a bank and you've got money in the bank, unless it's, I guess, a Silicon Valley bank, wouldn't you put guards and alarms on the bank? Because if you had a house and there's a burglar in there, wouldn't you lock your windows? So if we have interests to protect, wouldn't we develop the military capacity and capability to protect our own interests? Is that just not common sense?
What about what Admiral McRaven said about this?
What happened to him?
I don't know, but I don't understand. I don't understand how this common ground on climate, let's say, with the Chinese communists allows us to separate China from the Russians.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't talked to the Admiral in many, many years, but just speaking very candidly, because what he said was just gobbledygook and nonsense. And how a guy with a distinguished military career and real combat experience could say something like that is beyond me. And all I can say is they get on the cocktail circuit and they hang out with these liberals, and I guess eventually they just kind of drink the Kool-Aid or something. But the notion that somehow the problem with us and the Chinese is we just need to find ways to cooperate. The Chinese, this is like inviting Hannibal Lecter over for dinner. And the answer is, well, if we just agree on the menu, everything will be fine. I mean, this is nonsense.
I wanted to get your take on that Afghanistan withdrawal after action report that was released on Holy Thursday indeed. And we talked about it a bit on Friday, but here's what National Security Council John Kirby had to say about it. Number one, Trump's fault.
But while it was always the president's intent to end that war, it is also undeniable that decisions made and the lack of planning done by the previous administration significantly limited options available to him.
And number two,
and
no
so
chaos.
For all this talk of chaos, I just didn't see it, not from my perch. At one point during the evacuation, there was an aircraft taking off full of people, Americans and Afghans alike, every 48 minutes, and not one single mission was missed. So I'm sorry, I just won't buy the whole argument of chaos.
Trump's fault, no chaos. Went flawlessly, Jim.
Yeah, so, no chaos thing. I was actually communicating with people in real time, sending emails back and forth. with like children from the American University desperately trying to get into the airfield who actually had seats on planes but couldn't get through the security because it was so chaotic. So maybe it's just former Navy guys, but everything he said was absolutely ludicrous, and he should resign. He should be ashamed of himself and resign. But here to me is the real bottom line. If they had a smoking gun of a serious report that actually demonstrated that everything they did was perfect and everything wrong was Donald Trump's fault, would they have dumped it on the dead news day before Easter? Or would they have had a national press conference and spent weeks talking about that? And the answer is, of course they have nothing, which is why they dumped it when they did.
Yeah, and I got to say, in addition to sort of the no chaos line that will live in infamy, the other line in an exchange with Peter Doocy about with the question, well, who's going to get fired over this? What where is the accountability up the chain of command? And Kirby now I think infamously said, "This is not about accountability." Yeah, exactly. No, we know that is like a standard operating procedure in D.C. generally, but this is not about accountability. Should replace "In God We Trust" on federal buildings.
Well, here's the fundamental problem there, which was this is a decision that was made by Joe Biden against military advice, where he essentially scared himself out of Afghanistan because he was just terrified that it was going to collapse on his watch and he was going to get blamed for it. And so he came up with this cockamamie idea of how to sneak out and nobody would notice, and then Afghanistan would fall after he left, and he'd say it's not my problem. So against military advice, against common sense, against what his allies would have recommended to him if he had bothered to actually talk to them, he does this, he makes this decision. And so it falls squarely on the shoulders of the President of the United States. So who are you going to hold accountable? I mean, everybody will say, literally, we just followed orders. The accountability is with the President of the United States. And short of impeachment, the only other method of accountability is elections. That's just the way things are.
He is the Heritage Foundation's Lieutenant Colonel Jim Carafano. Jim, thank you as always.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, and he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
This is the morning show more Chicago radio listeners are choosing. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Balance of Nature has been using whole fruits and vegetables to change lives for decades. But did you know about Balance of Nature's revolutionary fiber product? Balance of Nature's Fiber and Spice uses a well-researched